Have you ever wondered what happens when a quiet dinner leads someone to rediscover a part of themselves they thought was gone? This is the story of Emma Blake, a woman who thought her life was complete, until one unexpected evening reminded her that the heart never forgets how to feel. Sometimes, the most powerful love story is the one we find within ourselves. The morning light poured gently through the tall kitchen window, turning the edges of Emma Blake's coffee cup into soft gold. Outside, the quiet street lay under a thin blanket of mist, and the world felt hushed as if holding its breath before the day began. Emma stood still for a moment, watching the sunlight move across the counter. It was a simple sight, yet it carried a kind of peace she both loved and feared. Peace could be comforting, but it could also be lonely. At 42, Emma's life had settled into a rhythm so gentle it sometimes felt invisible. She taught part-time art classes at the community center, tended to her small garden, and kept the house warm and welcoming for her husband, Daniel, who worked long hours at a marketing firm. They had been married for almost 15 years, years that had brought comfort, familiarity, and a quiet understanding that didn't always need words. And yet, as she looked at her reflection in the kitchen window, she saw something she rarely allowed herself to notice: a flicker of longing. It wasn't for someone or something specific, more like a whisper of what life used to feel like when every day carried possibility. There had been a time when Emma dreamed of painting full-time, traveling, maybe even opening a small gallery near the lake. She could still remember the scent of turpentine, the way color moved under her brush. But life had a way of gently redirecting dreams until they became smaller, quieter, like the soft hum of a song she once knew by heart. The clock ticked softly. Daniel's voice broke her thoughts as he called from upstairs. "Honey, have you seen my blue tie?" "It's on the chair by the window," she replied, smiling faintly. She always remembered where things were. It was part of what she did best, keeping everything steady, everything smooth. When Daniel came down, he looked rushed but grateful. "You're a lifesaver," he said, leaning over to kiss her cheek before grabbing his coffee. His kindness was genuine, his warmth real. But somewhere in that easy exchange, Emma felt the distance of two people who had stopped truly seeing each other, not out of neglect, but from the quiet comfort of routine after he left. Emma sat at the table, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. The house fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses softly but stays long enough to make you think. That afternoon, she opened the email Daniel had forwarded, an invitation from his company's senior manager, Andrew Carter, suggesting a casual dinner to discuss an upcoming project. Daniel had replied enthusiastically, offering to host the dinner at their home. "He'll be here Saturday evening." The message ended. Emma read the words twice, then leaned back in her chair. She didn't know much about Andrew, except that he was respected.com, and rumored to be the kind of leader who remembered everyone's name. There was something about preparing for guests, setting the table, choosing the menu, creating warmth that made her feel useful again, alive with quiet purpose. Over the next few days, she planned everything carefully: the menu, the lighting, even the soft background music she'd play during dinner. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about creating something beautiful, something that felt intentional. On Friday evening, as she polished the last piece of silverware, Emma caught her reflection again, this time in the dining room mirror. She paused, studying herself under the amber glow of the lamp. There were faint lines near her eyes now, traces of laughter and time. But her expression held something else too. A softness, a quiet strength. "Maybe," she whispered to her reflection, "it's not too late to feel something new." The next morning arrived with crisp air and the faint scent of rain. Emma woke early, filled with a mixture of nerves and excitement she couldn't explain. She opened the windows to let the cool breeze drift in, the curtains swaying like slow waves. Every detail mattered, not because anyone would notice, but because she did. By evening, everything was ready. Candles waited unlit on the table, and a vase of fresh lilies stood at the center, Daniel's favorite flowers. She wore a soft blue dress, simple but elegant, and let her hair fall naturally over her shoulders, as the clock neared 7. She heard Daniel pacing in the hallway, practicing his introduction. His voice carried pride, and she felt it too, not just for him, but for the life they had built together. And yet, as she stood by the window waiting for the sound of the doorbell, that quiet flicker returned, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Was it anticipation? Restlessness? Hope? Outside, headlights approached slowly, their glow breaking through the dusk. The sound of tires on gravel reached the doorstep, followed by a gentle knock. Emma smoothed the front of her dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door. There stood Andrew Carter, tall, composed, and wearing a kind smile that somehow felt both warm and unreadable. For just a moment, their eyes met. It was nothing more than polite courtesy. Yet something in that brief glance stirred the air between them. "Good evening, Mrs. Blake," he said softly. "Thank you for having me." Emma smiled back, her voice calm, but her heart quietly uncertain. "Please," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. "The pleasure's ours." And as he crossed the threshold, the faintest shiver of emotion passed through her. Not desire, not fear, but the quiet recognition that something in her still longed to feel. Asterisk, asterisk, and that evening. Without realizing it, Emma's ordinary world was about to change, not through drama or chaos, but through the gentle awakening of a heart that had been waiting to be seen. Asterisk, asterisk. The dinner began with laughter that sounded slightly too practiced, the kind that fills the silence before real conversation begins. Daniel guided the talk toward work, eager to impress, while Emma moved quietly around the table, refilling glasses, serving food, and smiling at the right moments. It all looked perfect. The meal, the conversation, the candlelight dancing softly against the walls. Yet inside, Emma felt something faintly stirring, like the echo of a forgotten song, when Andrew Carter looked at her and thanked her for the meal. His tone was simple, respectful. "You have a gift," he said. "The atmosphere here feels peaceful." Emma smiled politely. "That's kind of you to say." But something about his words and the sincerity behind them opened a door she hadn't realized was still closed, a quiet space inside her where the past lived softly, like dust motes caught in the light, long before she became Mrs. Blake. Emma had been Emma Reed, a college art student with big dreams and paint under her fingernails. She remembered the smell of turpentine on her hands, the creak of the studio floorboards, and the constant hum of rain against the windows. And she remembered Michael Hayes, the quiet boy from her art history class who always sat one row behind her. He wasn't loud or charming, but his presence had a stillness that drew people in. They'd started talking one afternoon when the professor's projector failed, and class turned into casual chatter. "You draw with light," he had said, studying the sketchbook she had left open on her desk. "No one's ever said that to me before," she had replied, surprised. "Well, that's what it feels like," he'd said with a shy smile. It had been such a small exchange, yet it lived in her memory, the way he had seen her. Not as a student or a face in the crowd, but as someone whose art carried meaning. They began talking more after that, about color, about travel, about the little details people often overlook. Their connection was quiet but real, growing through moments that didn't demand attention. There were no grand gestures, no confessions, only warmth, laughter, and the soft awareness that someone understood her heart. Then life, as it often does, shifted course. Michael's father fell ill, and he left school to take care of his family. He promised he'd return next semester, but he never did. Letters were written, at first brief, honest ones about how he missed the smell of paint and the sound of her laughter. But time began to stretch, and silence grew between them. Eventually, she stopped expecting his name in the mail. Years later, when she met Daniel Kind, dependable Daniel, she had been ready for a steadier kind of love. He didn't speak in metaphors or send letters from faraway places. He brought her flowers from the local market and listened when she worried about her students. It was love in a quieter language, one she grew to cherish. Still, every so often, when the world slowed, she would catch a memory in passing, the way rain sounded on the old studio roof. Or how Michael once said that art wasn't just seen, it was felt. Those echoes lived softly inside her, not as longing, but as a reminder of a version of herself she rarely visited. As the evening continued, Emma found herself watching Andrew as he spoke, not out of curiosity, but familiarity. He had that same calm steadiness Michael once had, the kind of gentleness that didn't need to fill every silence. When Daniel stepped away to answer a work call, Emma and Andrew were left alone for a brief moment. "Your home feels like it has stories," Andrew said quietly. Glancing toward the framed painting near the window, Emma smiled, following his gaze. "That one's mine. I painted it years ago." He tilted his head. "It's beautiful. There's a stillness in it, but also a kind of longing." Her breath caught for a moment. No one had described her art like that in years. "You can tell that just from looking," she asked softly. He nodded. "Sometimes the quietest things say the most." The room felt suddenly smaller, filled not with tension, but with a delicate understanding, the kind that has no intent, only recognition. Before she could reply, Daniel returned, cheerful and unaware. The conversation shifted again, light and ordinary. But Emma's heart remained touched by that simple moment, by the reminder that being seen wasn't about attention. It was about someone noticing what others no longer did. Later, when the guests had gone and Daniel was busy stacking dishes, Emma walked back to the living room, drawn to her old painting. The brush strokes seemed different now, as if they held new meaning. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. The woman she had become, standing beside the dreams she once held. She thought of Michael's quiet smile, of how life had carried them in different directions, and of how, even now, those small moments from years ago still whispered softly through her heart. Emma didn't feel regret, only gratitude. Every connection, no matter how brief, had shaped her into who she was. And as she stood there, the faint scent of lilies still in the air, she realized something. Sometimes the past doesn't fade. It simply waits quietly, patiently, until the right moment to remind you that you once dared to feel deeply. Asterisk, asterisk, and tonight. For the first time in years, Emma could hear those echoes again, not to pull her backward, but to gently lead her back to herself. Asterisk, asterisk, the following week passed in its quiet, predictable rhythm. Morning coffee, the hum of the washing machine, the late afternoon sunlight stretching across the dining room floor. Yet something in Emma's world had changed, not in appearance, but in feeling. The dinner had left behind a stillness that wasn't empty. It was reflective. Like a pause in a familiar song, she thought often of the conversation with Andrew, the way he'd noticed her painting, how his words had carried understanding rather than flattery. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it gently, without expectation. It reminded her of how Michael once spoke years ago, with that same quiet care for meaning. But Emma didn't dwell on it as something more. It wasn't about him. It was about what had awakened within her. It was Thursday afternoon when the phone rang. Daniel's voice came through, bright and hurried. "Emma, Andrew just asked if I could drop by the office to go over some numbers. He also wondered if you'd be willing to bring the dessert recipe from the dinner. He hasn't stopped talking about it." Emma laughed softly. "The lemon cake." "Yes. He said his sister would love it. You wouldn't mind coming by with me, would you?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Of course not. It was just a brief visit," she told herself. Nothing more than kindness. A simple gesture of hospitality. When they arrived at the office that evening, the building was quiet. Most of the staff gone for the day. The sky outside had turned amber, last traces of daylight stretching through tall windows. Andrew greeted them in the lobby with his usual calm warmth. "You didn't have to come all the way here," he said, smiling at Emma. "It was no trouble," she replied, handing him the neatly written recipe card. "It's simple, really. Just make sure not to overbake it. I'll take your word for it," he said. With a light laugh, Daniel was quickly drawn into a discussion about marketing reports, leaving Emma by the window. She looked out at the city lights flickering to life, tiny constellations against the fading sky. Andrew joined her a moment later, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "Decaf," he said. "It's what I drink at this hour." She accepted the cup with a soft smile. "Thank you." For a while, they stood in companionable silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was calm. It's a kind of quiet where thoughts didn't need words. You have a way of making things feel grounded, Andrew said after a moment, his tone thoughtful. "That dinner, the warmth in your home, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Emma turned slightly toward him. "What's that?" He looked down, smiling faintly. "That stillness can be a kind of strength. Most people chase noise and movement. You create calm." His words lingered. They weren't romantic, they were observant, genuine, spoken with a quiet sincerity that reached somewhere deep. Emma thought about how she used to feel when painting centered. Alive, content with silence. She had missed that version of herself. Somehow, in his words, she found it again. "You notice things most people overlook," she said softly. Andrew glanced at her, his expression kind. "Maybe because I've learned that the small things matter most." Daniel's voice called from across the room. "We'll be done in a few minutes." Emma smiled and nodded, then turned back toward the window. The city lights blurred slightly against the glass, and she realized she wasn't looking at the skyline. She was looking through it into memory, into the quiet places her heart had kept safe. "Do you ever miss who you were before life got busy?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Andrew didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was thoughtful. "Every now and then. But sometimes meeting new people helps you remember parts of yourself you thought were gone." Emma felt something gentle move through her. Not longing, but understanding. It was strange how life could circle back. Not to repeat, but to remind before leaving. Andrew handed her a folded napkin with a small sketch on it, a rough pencil drawing of a window with sunlight spilling through. "I drew this during a meeting once," said, almost apologetically. "You mentioned you paint. Maybe it'll inspire you to start again." Emma smiled, touched by the simple gesture. "Maybe it will." On the drive home, Daniel spoke about work, the upcoming project, and how grateful he was for how well everything was going. Emma listened, responding warmly, genuinely proud of him. But part of her attention remained with the folded napkin in her hand, the quiet reminder that art still lived somewhere within her, waiting. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Emma stood in her studio, the small room she hadn't entered in months. The air smelled faintly of old paint and cedar wood. She placed the napkin on her easel, sketched sunlight catching the dim glow of the lamp. It was a small, imperfect drawing, but it meant something. Slowly, almost without thinking, she reached for a brush. The motion felt both foreign and familiar, like greeting an old friend after years apart. The first stroke was shaky, then smoother, then free. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window. Inside, the rhythm of her brush kept time with her heartbeat. For the first time in years, Emma wasn't painting for anyone, not for a class, not for Daniel, not for approval. She was painting because it made her feel. And as the night deepened, she realized that her heart wasn't rekindling a romance. It was rekindling her life. Asterisk, asterisk. Some encounters don't begin new stories. They awaken the ones we quietly paused. Asterisk, asterisk, the days that followed slipped quietly into place, like pages turning in a well-loved book. Daniel left early for work. Emma painted in the mornings now, her studio once again filled with soft light and the scent of acrylics dot. At first, she painted cautiously, unsure if the spark she felt was real or fleeting. But each brushstroke brought back something she hadn't realized. She'd lost her calm, her clarity, her sense of self. The painting on her easel grew slowly into a scene of sunlight streaming through an open window. The same image Andrew had sketched on that napkin, yet where his drawing had been a single window. Emma's canvas was filled with color, blue sky, golden light, a small vase of lilies resting on the sill. It wasn't just art. It was a quiet reflection of her heart reopening. One evening, as she stepped back to study her work, she heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway. He walked in with his usual warmth but stopped short when he saw the painting. "You finished it," he said softly. I didn't know you were painting again. Emma smiled. I didn't either, not until recently. He studied the canvas, his expression thoughtful. It's beautiful, Em. It feels peaceful. His words touched her. For a long time, their conversations had revolved around schedules and dinner plans. Now, standing together in front of her painting, she felt a small bridge forming between them again. Something real, simple, and true. I've missed this, she said quietly. Not just painting, but feeling like I'm part of something that's mine. Daniel nodded slowly. I think I forgot how much this means to you. I've been so caught up in work, I didn't realize you'd stopped. Honesty was gentle, not defensive. And in that moment, Emma saw him, not as the man who had drifted away, but as the same person who once believed in her completely. A few days later, she found herself standing outside the glass doors of Daniel's office building. She had brought the finished painting, wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with string. Andrew had sent an email thanking her again for the recipe and asking if she didn't mind whether he could see how the window painting turned out. His tone had been kind, professional, and respectful. Emma had agreed to bring it by, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. When she entered his office, the late afternoon light fell across the floor in long golden lines. Andrew looked up from his desk, a warm smile crossing his face. You finished it, he said, his tone quiet but full of genuine admiration. I did, she replied, carefully setting the painting against the wall. It felt right to show you. Your sketch reminded me what I'd been missing. He stepped closer, studying the colors, the soft play of light. It's beautiful, Emma. It feels like hope. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air calm and steady. There was no unspoken longing between them, no crossing of boundaries, only gratitude. Thank you, she said, for reminding me that stillness can mean more than silence. Andrew looked at her, his expression thoughtful. You did that yourself. Sometimes people just hold up a mirror. You're the one who looked. She smiled. Maybe we both needed one. There was something final yet peaceful in that moment. The kind of closure that doesn't need words. Two people who had crossed paths at the right time, each helping the other remember something they had forgotten. That night, Emmett and Daniel sat on the porch, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain. Daniel reached for her hand. You've seemed lighter lately, he said. Like the Emma I met all those years ago. She turned toward him, her heart full. I think I just remembered how to breathe again. He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. I'm glad. I want to be part of that, part of what makes you happy. You already are, she said softly. I just needed to find myself again to see it. The world around them was quiet. No grand music. No dramatic ending, only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Carrying with it the kind of peace that comes after understanding. Emma leaned back, watching the fading colors of the sky. Life hadn't changed in any extraordinary way. She was still a wife, an artist, a woman learning to balance the two. But something within her had shifted forever. She had learned that love wasn't about losing yourself in another person. It was about being seen, remembered, and still belonging to yourself. A week later, her painting hung in the community center where she taught. Beneath it, a small plaque read, ****, The Window Within, by Emma Blake. ****. People stopped to look at it. Some smiling, some standing quietly. As if hearing their own echoes in her colors, Emma watched from a distance, her heart calm and open. She thought of Andrew, of Michael, Daniel, each connection a thread that had led her back to herself, and as sunlight poured through the tall windows, Emma smiled, feeling the warmth of a life gently rediscovered. ****, sometimes. The most beautiful stories aren't about falling in love again. They're about remembering the love that was always there, waiting for us to return.